because when you do that, you always leave out somebody. So I just want to have a special appreciation, round of applause for everybody who worked so hard. Thanks. So our next keynote speaker is the very fierce Amy Webb, and she describes herself as a digital media futurist and serial entrepreneur. Among her accomplishments, and there are just too many to list, but among them, she is the founder of her own digital strategy consulting firm, Webbmedia Group, and she's the co-founder of the very well-known Spark Camp. Maybe some of you have attended Spark Camp. Amy's also a visiting Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. She's one of Columbia Journalism Review's 20 Women to Watch in Media, and Forbes' Women Changing the World. Amy is really well known for her terrific tech trends talks, and so today she's here to share her insights on trends for women in digital news. Please welcome Amy Webb.
Am I on? Yeah? Can you guys hear me? So I pretty much, I think, know everybody, or most of you, so I won't bother with too much of this. So three things about me. I'm a futurist, which basically means that I research near future and emerging trends in digital media and emerging technology, and take that information and advise our clients on their business strategy and what they should do next. And we do that through reports and quarterly meetings, and we do pop-up think tanks and other things like that. If you're looking at me and I look familiar, I'm also the woman who hacked online dating. So the other reason you know me. So every December, we put out this big report for the coming year on all of the trends that we think will matter. That came out in December, and this year we highlighted 55 trends and more than 100 companies that we think are important for folks in the media and the technology space to watch. So today what I'm going to do is take 3 of those trends and recast them and explain how they relate directly to you as women and people in the news space, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're a funder. So with that in mind, the first trend has to do with putting your audience and not their mobile devices first. So this is dramatically oversimplifying things, but essentially what happens in the editorial process is there's a decision made pretty early on. Is this story going to be a longer story or a shorter story? Is there, we just saw a great, beautiful slide, data component, social component. What are the different components of this story? But in the process of doing that, what we're really talking about is how are we going to distribute this story? So anybody who hasn't been part of a conversation around mobile first, it was probably just asleep, because you've all been part of those conversations over the past year, because that's what everybody wants, right? How do we get our content to be mobile first? The subtext of that is, how do we get millennials to pay attention to us, and they all have phones, right? So how do we get our content seen more quickly first? And really what this does is it pits the device ahead of the consumer. And as journalists, you shouldn't be creating content for the device that people are holding. You should be trying to create the device, or create content that makes sense for that person in that moment of time, based on whatever it is that they're doing. So the real questions, therefore, are, what are the other dimensions of news? And what are the activities of your consumer at that moment in time when she's hopefully consuming your content? So Dana is sitting in the back of the room, I hope. She just stepped out. Of course, that's what always happens, right? You should find her later. She's over there. So Dana teaches at West Virginia University, and she's doing some incredible work on drones and artificial intelligence, and they're doing some amazing stuff there. So Dana's a smart woman. She used to be a photojournalist. Let's all pretend like we want to program content for Dana, okay? Which you should want to do. So here's the thing, though. Dana's on the move. She's got a million things going on. She's a parent. So the question is, she's got her mobile device, right? So let's say that you're programming for the mobile first. Just because the content's on the mobile device and she happens to have it with her doesn't necessarily mean that whatever you're producing for that device is going to make sense for her. So to that effect, phones have accelerometers, which means that your phones can intuit whether or not you are jogging or driving, because they can measure the distance, the speed at which you're going, right? So if you're driving that means that on the mobile device, a longer story makes sense because, well, unless she's driving, then well, then you would want an audio version, right? But if she's going, let's say, 60 miles an hour, then maybe right now send a text message alert of whatever that story is that's read aloud. Or maybe give her a longer version. If she's clearly jogging and, she tends to maybe listen to podcasts, so Jake, this is something you guys can work on. What is the jogging version of this story where we could send her a meaningful audio version of whatever this thing is, right? Is this the first time that she's listened to this topic, right? So does she already know about whatever the story is, because she's visited your site more than once, or is this the first time she's hearing about it? In the case of Dana, right, if she's looking at a story about ISIS, in her case, she may actually be not thinking about ISIS, the terrorist organization, but instead ISIS, the mobile wallet, which had its name first, and that was a problem, obviously. What's trending for her, right? So based on the people that she knows, what they're paying attention to, what they're talking about, what are the pieces of content that will make sense for her given this moment in time and what she's thinking about? Will she engage right now? Is she at a conference? Is she meeting with a source? Is she at home? Is she at work? The phone knows all of these things about us. It can infer all of these things, and you have access to this information. So the question is, how do you marry that together with your content in order to make a more meaningful content experience? So the way that we sort of figure all of this out is we have this attention matrix that we use with our clients, and we ask them to think about putting their consumers in the middle. So think about time, their activities, their behavior, and their desire to be smarter, faster, which is the IQ piece, or to have some kind of emotional attachment. And so I'm going to go through these quickly, but when we talk about timing, can you develop your news content or your application or whatever it is for the news consumer at a particular moment in time, given that there are n variables, right? But for whatever it is what Dana is doing right now, right? What about her activities? We know that she likes to jog. Actually, I have no idea if you like to jog. Let's pretend like she likes to jog. She likes to fly some drones, right? She's got 1 million kids. So based on her activities, how do we reframe and recast the story for her? But what about her behaviors? Can we use predictive analytics and contextual information in order to predict whether or not she's going to engage with this story type? And finally, IQ and EQ. Dana, whether it's Dana or anybody else, is there a way for you to develop this content so that your news consumer feels smarter, faster, or so that they have some kind of emotional connection to whatever it is that you're creating? So now I'm going to talk smack about the New York Times. So if we were to apply this methodology and this framework to the New York Times mobile apps, and they've been through a bunch, so put all of those caveats out there. There's been a lot of experimentation, and they're working forward. But this is what exists today, right? So we've got a bunch of stories, and on the right-hand side, here's a story that goes on for quite a while. You sort of scroll and scroll and scroll, and it looks nice on a mobile phone, but it could care less about who I am and what I'm doing, right? So here's another example. This looks really, really good on a mobile device. There's a lot of white space. It's designed well, right? In theory, it's kind of like a listicle. But this thing scrolls until the end of the universe, right? And it's not inferring anything about me or my needs or what I'm doing. So if I were to plot that on the matrix, I would say that these stories are designed to get me smarter, but they're ignoring all of these other elements. There's an app called Nuzzle, which I've been talking a lot about, and we'll talk about it again until people understand what I mean. But there's this app called Nuzzle, and what Nuzzle does is it incorporates your social feeds. And it's not the end-all, be-all, but it's doing some really, really clever things. So it sort of waits for a bunch of people to share content that they're interested in. And the way that I've sort of configured this is that I'm following particular accounts that will give me a sort of wide swath of information that will make sense to me. And then it shares just the right amount of information at the right time when I am most likely to engage. And the entire thing, therefore, is much more engaging, right? Interestingly enough, so experiment with that and take a look at it. But what I'm really trying to get at here is, what is the Google Now for news, right? If you've got an Android, you're using Google Now as it is. Google Now is also available on an iPhone. Google now sort of gives you the right information at the right moment in time. It helps you remember where you parked your car. It tells you when your hand cream is coming. It also gives you news stories, right? But at the moment, it's a utility layer on top of your life, not a content layer. Well, what happens if we thought of Google Now and recast it as a content layer with some of that utility? All right, so think about what that experience, therefore, might be like for me. So, this is what I walked this morning. This is missing some zigzags because I'm lost, and I got lost again this morning, but I was supposed to walk that way, right? So if you sort of think about my walk plus getting some coffee, I've got about 7 minutes worth of time, right? So if you were to pull in my calendar, my contacts, all of the other information that's already stored in the phone, suddenly you can provide both a content and a utility layer for me that would be indispensable. So for example, I've got 7 minutes. The ICFJ has this great story on how to encrypt emails using this app. 11 slang terms you think that are new or in fact, are ancient. Once I arrive here, right, I get a notification because it's got this utility layer that, by the way, Marianne Reed, who's the Dean of West Virginia University, is standing 10 feet ahead of me next to Cindy, and Jennifer Preston, the Knight Foundation is 20 feet in that direction, and she's standing next to Shazna. Whether or not you think this is spooky, this is possible, right? And this, becomes actionable information that I can do something with. And basically what that therefore means is if you start thinking less about the device and more about the person who's holding that device, right? Suddenly a world of possibility is there for you to take. And so if you can think of this mathematically too. So if your consumer expectations are X, right, given Y variables at T time, I may be boring everybody with this, but bear with me. Then basically what that equation spells out is, what is the X version of this story? What's the blank version of this story for all of your possible audience members, right? So that means that algorithmically, right, you can do this. You can figure out with every story, right, based on algorithm, what is the standing on the line version at Starbucks version of this story? What is the running on the treadmill at the gym version of this story? What is the snowpocalypse? I guess we're stuck here for the next 2 days, but then there wasn't any snow, but we're going to pretend like there's snow version of this story. What's the 5-minute downtime between meetings version of the story, right? And on and on and on. You have to put your audience first. So one of the biggest trends that we are seeing outside of journalism is that everybody else in the tech space and the people sort of in the tangential media space are working very hard on putting their audiences first. And news organizations say all the time that this is exactly what they're doing, but they're not. If they were, we would see something different, right? You have to put your audience first, not your audience's devices. So how do you put this trend into action? So that matrix that I showed you is a really easy way to get started. So take that matrix and plot the app that you're working on, or the app that you're funding, or the project that you're working on. Think about those 4 quadrants and figure out how close you're getting to the center of that, to the center. Now, there are ways to put this even further into action by experimenting with algorithmic curation and things like that. But just putting your audience first and changing that language from mobile first to audience first will be a great way to get started. So the second trend is virtual assistants who can talk. So we're all friends here, right? This was me shortly after giving birth. It was a dark day. I foolishly thought that I could do like my husband and I. There were bets that people had placed to see who was going to go back to work first, and I lost. So I was I couldn't stay away, so I was sort of back at work 3 days after arriving home from the hospital. And there is my poor child sitting at my home office desk. And I'm on the phone with my coworkers. I've got broken stuff. I'm pumping. I've got my mobile device going off. And I quickly realized that this was a terrible mistake. And I'm sort of sitting there at literally at that moment daydreaming about Jarvis. Not Jeff Jarvis, although who wouldn't daydream about you, Jeff? But there are some similarities here between Jarvis and Jarvis. So for those of you not familiar with the pantheon of comic book heroes, so Jarvis is the artificially intelligent sort of bot that helped out Iron Man. And Jarvis was this all-knowing, this is just going to get worse the longer that I talk, this all-knowing being who always had the right information and could sort of just solve problems as they would arise and anticipate every one of your needs. And anticipation here is the key word. And one of the trends that we're seeing is in an area called smart virtual personal assistants. So let me just sort of show you what this looks like in practice. I'm about to get you very excited about an application that you cannot download anymore. So this thing existed for just a couple of weeks. It was called Emu. And Emu was an application that would replace your text messaging service. So if you use Line, for example, or WhatsApp, this was meant, or just your regular SMS, this was a replacement for that. This is a conversation between my sister and I guess talking more about comic book heroes. Literally all we did was I texted her to see if she wanted to see a movie. She texted back yes, right? And immediately it started pulling up, it geolocated both of us. It showed us what movies were playing, at what theaters that were equidistant between us. It showed us what times those movies were playing. It looked at our calendars to see, I had meetings, she's got, her social life. Based on our availability, we could basically see Captain America at 7 o'clock, right? And then it said, do you want to buy tickets? I had mentioned something about dinner. It found us a restaurant based on our tastes and preferences that were within the general area of that movie theater. And we literally typed in 2 sentences, right? So Jarvis, this is like Jarvis, right? The whole thing happened on the back end without any additional work from us. So it saved an enormous amount of time, right? And that's just my sister and I going back and forth about a movie. For those of you who run small businesses, for those of you who are on teams who are using Slack and think that Slack is the greatest thing ever, and then you sort of realize that, well, wait a minute, now we couldn't agree to anything in the real world, now we can't also agree to anything on Slack. This solves all of those problems. In a sense, these things are like autocomplete for our intentions, right? Which is really powerful if you stop and think about the implications of that. Now, there were a bunch of these apps that launched over the past 18 months. That was Emu, Donna, and Emu was acquired by Google. Donna was acquired by Yahoo. Q was acquired by Apple, right? Goes on and on and on. So you can't get any of these things anymore. So the question is, what's next? Well, what's next are, instead of these being freestanding apps, these virtual assistants will be part of many of the technologies that we use going forward, starting this year. So this is a project out of France called SNPs, and it's meant to do a lot of the same things, but they've actually plugged into the transportation grid. And what they've been able to do, just by, again, sort of listening in on the back end, is they've been able to use predictive modeling to predict how crowded the trains will be 3 days into the future. And they've been accurate, right? So that's great, but what about 10 seconds into the future? So one of the big changes that we're seeing, and I'm about to show you something really cool, is that these assistants now can pay attention to the last, minute or so of our conversation, plus look at all of this other information that we're creating digitally, and then predict our thought process. So watch this.
I need to buy a birthday present for my sister. Do you have any cardigans in pink?
So this is just me talking to my computer.
What about in blue?
Okay, so it's not perfect, right? It's obviously showing things that are not just cardigans. But the point here is that this is an API now that was built by a company called Expect Labs. And that the idea is that it wants you to have sort of Jarvis in your pocket wherever you go, right? So this is me having a conversation with a website, trying to buy a present for my sister for her birthday, and it's making recommendations based on all this stuff, right? And what's there. Now, it's not perfect, but the reason that this has me so excited is because this thing came out of Expect Labs, which also built an app called MindMeld, which also was only around for a couple of months while it was doing user testing. And this allowed me to have a conversation in real time with somebody else. And as I'm talking to them, it would populate my iPad with everything that we were talking about, right? So when I used to be a journalist, and I'm interviewing sources, and they're mentioning acronyms or things, and I keep, I would always sort of stop the conversation and ask them what they were talking about, but it oftentimes interrupted the flow. Suddenly, this is just feeding me all of the information, and it's anticipating what we're going to talk about next in the conversation, right? This stuff is real, and it's about to become a part of everything that we do. So, now let's think about this within the context of Vox, famous for explainers, right? Everybody loves to make fun of explainers, but the reason that these things are so popular is because people just want to know what's going on, and they don't want a lead graph and a significance graph and a nut graph, and they don't care what an inverted pyramid is. They just want the information. So, if we think about everything I've been talking about, and if you apply that information layer, those virtual assistants to news, right? Suddenly I can have a conversation. Hey, what's this ISIS thing everybody's talking about, right? Or, WikiLeaks. I'm about to work on this WikiLeaks project, Mom. Mom can be like, hey, what's this WikiLeaks thing? It's different from just typing that question in from Google, right? This is understanding me and providing me with a personalized explainer in real time, right? Game changing. So, how do you put this trend into action? There are virtual assistants and voice interfaces and APIs and opportunities all over the place. So get with the team and start brainstorming. How might you apply some of this to the projects that you're working on? And think further ahead. Think 18 months down the road, 24 months down the road. How could you start applying this technology? How could you do it in different languages? How could this service different populations? All right, the final trend is something that I call one-to-few publishing. So how many people, just for fun, how many people have ever in this room been a part of a conversation about scale? You either ask the question, is it going to scale? Right? You've had to answer the question, is it going to scale? So my recommendation is that we ban use of the word scale. Testify, preach. Here's why. So I've been looking up the etymology of that word and the real definition, right? And scale really means how can you either expand or retract something, right, so that the dimensions stay the same, or will something climb up, right? Now, venture capitalists and people in the funding world, they use scale, oftentimes to mean like growth of audience or growth of money, but scale doesn't necessarily relate to people in the content and the news business, right? It's measuring the wrong thing. So when we have these conversations about scale, my fear is that they're taking us down a road that's not the right road for us to be traveling on. Because scale doesn't imply impact, right? It's incongruous. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. Just because you make a bunch of money or sell it, Elo, right? If you have anybody who's used Elo, right? We all got really excited about Elo. I'm talking about going down the wrong path. I'll stop. So scale doesn't imply impact, and it also has nothing to do with attention. Not necessarily, right? But those are the two metrics that matter in news, right? And in content. So one of the key trends that we're noticing is one that reframes scale so that instead we're thinking about impact and we're thinking about attention. And that's in this sort of one-to-few space, right? So I'm going to pick on Jeff since he's here. So how many you have like 1 billion trillion Twitter followers? 250,000?
140,000.
Okay, huge number. And BuzzMachine has a whole bunch of traffic, right? So you're this personality, like everybody knows who you are, right? But you don't work for the New York Times, and you don't talk on NPR all the time. You are one person publishing to a relative few number of people, but the impact that you have, there's no way to overstate the amount of impact there's no way to state the amount of impact, right, that you have. And there are reverberations within this community anytime that you post something, right? So we're seeing that in lots of different places. So Jessica, are you here yet? So she's talking later today, Jessica Lesson. So she's a female founder of this incredible site and newsletter called The Information. Really, really, really good stuff. So she used to work for the Wall Street Journal, and she, went off on her own, and instead of trying to reach millions of people, she's reaching, fewer people, but with incredibly deep content. And when she posts things, that moves the needle. People pay attention. And she's making money doing it. So later on, I can tell you how much I'm paying for my subscription. which is like, I think like $400. And I'm happy to do it. Talk to her later to find out how she's doing. She's doing incredibly well. Foreign Policy Interrupted. So this, if you're not already subscribing, here's this incredible newsletter. I mean, really, really good stuff. How many people like curl up with foreign policy? I mean, I do.
We have to take a picture and being a stage.
But in all honesty, so Foreign Policy Interrupted is a newsletter written in an incredibly engaging voice that is intended to pull younger people, and women especially, into the world of politics, right, and foreign policy, and it's phenomenal. You're talking later today, but what's your growth been like? Because you're launching a site and a whole thing, right?
Yeah. We have about a few thousand subscribers to the newsletter, which is big. Mostly women, some men, but mostly women, and mostly editorial producers at networks and people in the industry.
But are you seeing an impact?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so again, it doesn't have to, you can do quite a bit with a few thousand people. It's a matter of telling that story differently to the people funding you. So just a couple of other quick ones. This is Erin Griffith, her editors have forced her to change the name of her newsletter, so now it's named something else. But this is a really, really clever, engaging newsletter that goes out to not a huge number of people, but quite a few. Alexis Madrigal has his Five Interesting Things newsletter, which again, there's an audience that's created, and of course we all know about Serial, right? And I don't know what Serial's exact, metrics are, but I can tell you that this thing wasn't aired on the radio. It was aired through I guess you could ask Jay because he probably knows better. We won't do that right now. But it was a unit of content that was delivered to a relatively smaller number of people, but had huge impact. Everybody was talking about this story. And Farai, let me go back. Farai, who's I think in the back, there she is. So Farai, same deal. So Farai was a personality that was on the radio, and now she's doing this incredible work with the One with Farai podcast. Same thing. So we've got this engagement. We've got people willing to take action. That sort of thing. And then there's so even at the end of the spectrum, Andrew Golis, who's done a bunch of stuff. He was at the Atlantic. He started this thing called This. Which I'm sure everybody has now heard of because you've got invites you want to share, or you're trying to get invites to this thing. And this is a relatively small network that allows you to share one link a day, one story a day, and that's it. That's the most social that you can possibly be. But this thing is one of the hottest tickets around. It's gaining all this traction, right? So I don't think that this is my account. I don't think that this is a flash in the pan because what we're talking about here is distribution. And again, if we reframe the word scale, right, because we all know it doesn't matter if you have 3 million Twitter followers, right, if a bunch of those are spam accounts, or if they're not clicking through, if they're not doing anything with your content. You are much better off having a small, engaged audience that is listening and taking action and doing something with your content. That's the metric that matters. And therefore, what we're really talking about is distribution. Everybody says that this is a renaissance with podcasts and newsletters, and I disagree. This is less of a renaissance, and it's more of a familiar pattern that we see, okay, that we've seen over and over again in technology. A tech, trend sort of happens, people adopt it, there's a first version, then something else happens, and there's a second wave, and a third wave, and a fourth wave. So if you are not currently already in the business of these sort of one to few networks, even if you're at a big publication, especially if you're at a big publication, now is the time to be doing that. Open rates with this stuff, extremely high. Audience engagement, extremely high. And newsletters, I'm seeing like with I've got one of these little niche things. I've got an open rate of 80%. 80% consistently. So anybody who's done anything with newsletters or podcasts knows what that means, right? It also creates a groundswell of attention and conversation. So how do you put this trend into action? The easiest way to do it, sign up for TinyLetter or one of the other services that are out there, and just start a newsletter, something small. Don't make a big announcement. Don't release a press release or anything. Just create something with a voice for a small defined audience as an experiment, and watch what happens with the data, and set some reasonable benchmarks to determine your impact and determine attention, and see what happens, what lessons you might be able to carry back over to everything else that you're doing, or the things that the people that you fund are doing. Thanks.